So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today. He's David Baraff. He's an Academy Award winner and a principal software engineer from Pixar Animation Studios. Now, see if you can pick which one he is sitting at this table. He's right here. He joined Pixar as a senior animation scientist in 1998. He actually got a start in computer graphics not very far from here, next to Governor Livingston High School, which he attended at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, where he worked on real-time 3D interactive animation and games during high school and college years. Later, while teaching robotics at Carnegie Mellon, he co-founded a startup commercial software company whose simulation software has been used in the production of numerous films. In particular, his first animation system for cloth in computer graphics was used in Stuart Little, Shrek, Spider-Man, Polar Express, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, to name a few. His first projects at Pixar included developing the hair and cloth simulation system used extensively in Monsters, Inc. I think this is so cool. In 2006, he had the great honor of receiving a Scientific and Technical Academy Award for his work on computer animated clothing. Taking a short break from clothing, he authored a water simulation system which was used in Finding Nemo and later films. And after this, his attention turned to the problem of producing a system capable of tailoring, literally, hundreds of garments required for films like The Incredible and Ratatouille. His most recent research has focused on new methods for efficiently producing high-quality garment models that can be simulated, a method used extensively throughout Toy Story 3. His research and development at Pixar has resulted in more than 18 patent awards and applications. Received his BS in engineering and computer science from University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in computer science from Cornell. Please welcome probably the coolest speaker we've ever had at Moody's, David Baraff.
Well, no pressure there. Okay. So math applied to the movies. Just a couple of preambles. Everyone's welcome to keep eating and get stuff. But I have to warn this side of the room, I got a laser pointer and I can only aim at one of the screens, and I'm right-handed, so it's going to be over there. So if you feel like moving during the course of this, feel free. So I'm the lunchtime mathematical entertainment, two words you don't often hear applied together, but let's just see how this goes. So I do a lot of work in what's called dynamic simulation. And what is dynamic simulation? Well, roughly speaking, the animators are responsible for animating the characters, posing them, giving them their emotions, but they can't be concerned with every last little detail. And so in particular, when there's stuff that needs to move around on its own let's see, is this working? 1 second. Yeah, okay, well, it's a little hard to see. And one other thing, if it's possible to bring the light levels down just a little bit as we go on, that would be great. So the animators move the characters around, but my software is concerned with moving the other elements around. So for example, we might have hair moving around on its own. We might have some water moving around on its own. Or we might have some cloth moving around on its own. Okay. And what I actually want to do today is, one more. Even little minor things like the ropes. This looks easy, but actually if you think about it, he's got 4 hands and we got dispensation that I only had to hold the rope with 2 of his hands. Made it a little bit easier. But let's go with something a little bit simpler. I'm actually going to rewind stuff a little bit. I'm just going to talk about math that I've used throughout my career. I'm actually going back to some graduate school days because I wanted to pick out a problem that was simple and complete enough that we could really deal with it. And so I'm going to do something a little bit simpler. This is called rigid body dynamics. And what's particular about this is, and the other things that you just saw, things were malleable, changeable, hair, water, cloth, they all move, they all deform. These are objects which can only rotate and translate, so they're a bit simpler. Let's go even a little bit simpler than this. We're going to look at this particular problem. Hey, go. A stack of falling blocks, and we're made it really simple. There's not even any friction involved, so everything just slides. And to get this even simpler, here's our first problem, falling bricks. So what we have here is a stack of bricks, and this is a little bit foreshortened from the projector, but trust me, they're overbalanced just like you saw. So as soon as we let this start going, it's going to topple over. And our job is to figure out what's going to happen here. So I'm going to give you 3 solutions as to what might happen. Now, hope all you can see, but the important thing is to note that where the bricks separate and where they stay together. So in particular, let me be very deliberate here for a second. Right over here, the bricks are going to stay together. They're going to pivot about this corner here, and they're going to lift up here. That's obvious. There's absolutely nothing else this second brick could possibly do. But the question is, and the first brick is going to stay on the floor. The question is, what are the rest of the bricks going to do? So here's solution number 1, where you can see that 2 bricks and 2 bricks at a time stay together. So that's one solution. Here's another possibility. All 4 bricks stay together. And here's a third solution where you can see each one pivoting on the successive one. So let's run this back and do by show of hands. You got to pick a solution. So who thinks it's going to do solution number 1? Raise your hand. Okay. Solution number 2, where it goes as a group of 4. Anybody? Raise their hand. No, nobody's going for that one. Okay, how about number 3? Okay. Raise your hand if you didn't vote. Yeah, okay. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about the modeling of this. What we're going to do is we're going to model this by assuming basically that the forces involved here, and that's what we're talking about. We need to compute the forces. The forces are only going to rise at points of contact, which I've labeled in green. And to further simplify this, I'm not even going to worry about the force on the bottom between this bottom brick and the floor, because I already know what the bottom brick is going to do. It's just not going to go anywhere. Okay? At the first instant that I start this brick is going to stay motionless. But the second brick is going to have some acceleration, and that's what we're worried about, and that's what we want to think about. So here's our super simple model. At these 2 points labeled in green, we have 2 forces, force 1 and force 2. And we know, because there's no friction, that those forces have to be completely in the vertical direction. They can't go from side to side at all, because that would take some friction. The other thing that we're thinking about is the acceleration at these points of contact. And the acceleration is telling us how much either up or down are the bricks going relative to one another. So that's it. 4 simple variables, and we have to figure out what's going on. So let's start and do a little bit of modeling here. Okay, so the first thing that I can tell you, and I'm not going to work through the math, but it's pretty straightforward, is I can tell you that the acceleration at contact point 1 depends linearly on the forces at F1 and F2. And the equation is very, very simple. My unknowns are the F1 and F2, and the other coefficients, M11, M12, and C1. Well, C1 is basically telling you about gravity, and M11 and M12 are telling you basically about gravity and the geometry of these objects. So the thing to keep in mind is details don't matter. The acceleration at point 1 depends linearly on the 2 forces. And similarly, the acceleration at point 2 is also a linear function of those 2 forces. Okay? So what we want to do now is just write this in a nicer form. So we're just going to go all matrix vector. I'm sure you've seen this sort of stuff. We're saying something very simple. Acceleration is a matrix times the forces plus some constant. Let's put that in a nice matrix form. And here I'm putting in blue our unknowns. And this is not really an equation so much as a relationship. Acceleration depends linearly on the unknown forces. So I haven't yet given you anything that you can solve. I've just said, here's the relationship between acceleration and force. The question is, what are the constraints, what are the properties that I'm looking for in solving this problem? Okay, and just to say, right now, this is the 2x2 system I would get if I have 2 contact points. If you imagine I have this fuller stack here, there's about 10 contact points. So this would turn out to be a 10 by 10 matrix. But let's just keep it simple for now, and I would have 10 force variables and 10 acceleration variables. Let's just keep it simple. Okay, so there's our equation. Well, what are some of the constraints? First, what do we know about the forces? Well, I'm going to write down that the force at contact point 1, or each contact point, is greater than or equal to 0. Does anyone want to guess what I'm trying to represent by that? Any takers? They have to go up. The forces between the blocks are repulsive. They can only push the blocks apart. They're not going to be sticky and pull them together. So a negative force would represent the blocks actually gluing themselves together, and we're not going to allow that. Okay? So that's one condition. Here's a second condition. It says something about the acceleration. Anybody want to take a stab at this one?
It can't be accelerating down into the other block.
Exactly. What I'm saying here is whatever forces you come up with, they better be strong enough so that the acceleration isn't downwards. The acceleration could be 0, which means the blocks stay together, or it could be positive so they separate. But if your forces aren't sufficiently strong that you get a negative acceleration, that's bad. That means the blocks are falling into one another. Okay? So at this point, this is almost enough to come up with a solution. In fact, the solution we want is one that satisfies these two constraints for all the variables. But unfortunately, this admits too many solutions because I can pick a really silly solution that satisfies these. Here it is. Set the two forces to like 1 billion. Okay, what do you get? You get the block, launching itself into outer space. That's obviously not the right answer, but it satisfies all the constraints. So I need to do one other thing. And this is very interesting, and this is where the problem gets really interesting. The question is, where are the blocks going to separate and where are they not going to separate? And here's the third constraint that we're going to add. Now, mathematically, this says that the product of f and a is 0. Non-mathematically, you can say this a very different way in English. If I say that the product is 0, I'm saying something profound. Either f is 0 or a is 0. So if you look at these two contacts, what this says is, hey, if the blocks are going to separate, if the acceleration is non-zero, I better have the force being 0. It doesn't make any sense that at the point where they start to pull away from one another, I actually need a force there. And the other possibility is, well, no, I actually have some non-zero force F, but if I have a non-zero force F, then the A better be 0. So at every contact point, one of two things happens. Either you separate or you don't, and you can express that very simply with this nice product. Okay, so let's actually take this and turn this into a matrix vector form. I've said that all the F's have to be non-negative, so I'm going to just write that as a vector. This is my vector of all the F's. And the same thing for the accelerations. And here I'm just using the fact that A is mf plus c. And if you take these two together here and you ignore the third one, this now looks like something very familiar. Is anyone familiar with linear programming? Heard of linear programming? Linear programming is used to solve all sorts of problems. And it basically says you've got a linear relationship and inequality constraints. But the problem is I've got this third one here, which I have to express, and this makes the problem more complicated. We're going to take that out. And this may not be obvious, but I can actually say that the sum of all these has to be 0, is the same as saying that each one of the products. And the reason is there's nothing negative. We restricted anything from being negative, so I can't possibly get that this one was negative and this one was positive and it came to 0. So writing down that each product is 0 is the same as saying that the sum is 0. And this is actually a fancy way of just writing down the dot product, which I'm going to do, which says basically the dot product of these two vectors is 0. Let's do one more substitution, and we get our final form. So this is called quadratic programming because I've got linear relationships, but I've got my f twice. And now this is finally the problem that we're trying to solve. And it's very simple. Find me an f that satisfies all these things. It's not negative, the accelerations aren't negative, and this dot product turns out to be 0. That's quadratic programming. OK, who voted for solution 1? Sorry, that was not it. Who voted for solution 3? Sorry. Who voted for solution 2? I'm sorry, it was a trick question. None of those are right. The people who didn't vote actually had the most correct answer. This is the actual solution, and what's very interesting is it's very counterintuitive, and it starts to show you why quadratic programming is hard. What quadratic programming is really doing, it is figuring out literally where does it break and where does it separate? And that's the hard part. It's not actually getting the numbers. It's knowing simply which are the points where the things are going to go to 0 or not. This is counterintuitive, but when you begin to think about it, it makes sense. You've got all this weight falling down. This guy wants to go down straight. These guys have to rotate to actually get out of the way. Let me show you what the actual animation looks like when you do this. Very, very slow motion. That's what they actually do. Now, quadratic programming is a hard problem. And by hard problem, I actually mean that in a couple of ways. Has anyone heard of the traveling salesman problem? Okay. It turns out that quadratic programming is, in its general form, equivalent in difficulty to the traveling salesman problem. Now, the traveling salesman problem has this nature that if you come up with the best known algorithms we know are basically time 2 to the n in the number of things you have to examine. So if you come up with an algorithm which can solve the traveling salesman problem for 50 cities, if you add one more city, it gets twice as hard. Add another city, twice as hard again. So this is a really, really bad thing because I got 2 contact points, fine. That's 2 to the 2 is 4. I got 10 contact points, that's 1,024. I do this in 3 dimensions and I've got 40 contact points, that's a problem. As it turns out, in general, it's a hard problem. The restriction to make it frictionless actually gives you a very reasonably easy solution. But these are some of the things that I have to be concerned with in my work, and it's very interesting that from this seemingly simple problem, you can get this immediate enormous complexity. Okay? So it's also hard in the sense that I was looking at the presentations this morning, and you're doing some very interesting modeling. When I started off working on this, and I needed to find software that would actually solve this, one of the problems that I ran into was that I could find software, but the software was geared pretty much towards solving one quadratic programming problem. What I mean by that is you would form up all your numbers for your matrix, you would run the software, and sometimes you would get an answer, and sometimes the algorithm would say, no, can't quite do it. And what would you do? You'd go back and you'd start adjusting little fiddly numerical constants in the algorithm until you finally got the problem to work. And that's fine when you only have one problem, okay? If you're dealing with your matrices and your systems, you can sit there and fiddle. But if we want to apply this to computer animation, which is why we're doing it, well, there are 24 frames per second when you're making a computer animated film, and you probably need to take multiple time steps for each frame. So we could literally find ourselves trying to solve 100 or 200 such problems for 1 second of animation. And so now you get to the problem of thinking industrially or really applied. It becomes a yield problem. If I can get this algorithm to work efficiently and it only breaks down 1% of the time, a bunch of people who use this would be happy. And I would be very, very sad because 1% of the time breaking down means that somebody starts to use my software and after a very little amount of time they're on the phone with me. So it's hard in several dimensions. So that was how we do the computation at one particular instant in time. Let's back up and go outwards a little bit and just talk about how simulation works in general. So let's talk about something like hair. And now the modeling might be something pretty simple. I got a bunch of points connected together with springs. The dark green points are telling me where the points are fixed. So this point is attached to the skin. This point has to be at a very particular angle coming out, but the rest of the hair is kind of free to move around. I apply gravity, and here's what we get. We take little steps in time. So basically the idea is if you know the forces involved in everything, you can take a small step forward in time and figure out what happens. Now as things move around, you get additional forces that come into play. So for example, as the hair begins to bend down, I would have an anti-bend force which starts to get stronger and is fighting gravity, and hopefully eventually this will settle into place. So we always have to make simplifications. We always have to make models no matter what we're doing. So if we take our character here and we actually look at the hairs that we simulate, that we simulate, it's actually a relatively sparse set. It's not really all that many compared with what we actually draw on the screen. So that's what we're drawing on the screen, but that's what we're actually using for our simulation. And we basically take a set of 4 hairs and we kind of grow ones in between. Now if we look at the problem of cloth, cloth is actually kind of similar in that we actually model cloth as a bunch of particles. We think of them grouped together as triangles. And so here's your tablecloth, but here's the view of what's going on in the computer for the modeling and the simulations. It's a triangle network. And again, energies. As you take a triangle and stretch it, it doesn't like being stretched, and forces arise which try to put it back to the size that it was. If you try to bend it, you get forces which try to make it flat. And everything is basically a competition between the forces and the motions and the external forces and gravity and such, and the internal forces that arise. So this is one of our earliest motion tests when I first arrived at Pixar. This is back in early, oh my God, 1999, probably this test was, maybe the year 2000. And at the time, the challenge of just getting one simulated garment through a movie was what we were concerned with. We just wanted to get this one shirt through the movie. So here's a very early motion test. Okay. Pretty good. There's actually a little bit of stuff going on there. If your eye is really keyed into detail, there's some problems. What's really kind of fun about cloth is a problem that is always lending itself to unexpected results. For example, this is a final shot from the movie. He scoops her up in the bag. And in fact, this is the first result that one of our simulation artists saw when they ran it through our software. So you're often called in to diagnose problems. Now, this problem actually turned out not to be a bug in the software, not to be a mathematical bug. It actually turned out that animators are very, very lazy. As you can see, she gets scooped up, and as soon as she leaves the frame, the animator stopped animating her. Well, after he had finished the animation, it turns out somebody pulled the camera back a little bit, and all of a sudden, her foot was visible for one frame, and they sent it back to the animator and said, get her foot out of the frame. Didn't matter how he did it, so he reached for the simplest control that would get her foot out of the frame. You and I might have thought of just moving her up. He just said, oh, you know, I'm just going to scale her down to 1/10 size. So she went to 1/10 size, the simulation kept running, and the shirt falls off. Now, what's the mathematics behind that kind of a simulation? Well, actually it turns out to be a little similar to what we were talking about before. It's a big matrix system, but now it's actually much simpler. It's a simple linear equation. Compute forces that satisfy this matrix system. But what does this matrix look like? Well, it's big. If you put 10,000 points in her shirt, and each point has 3 degrees of freedom, you get to a system of equations that's 30,000 by 30,000. So you've got a very big matrix system to solve. Now, the saving grace is that it's sparse. If you look inside this matrix A, almost any entry that you look at is going to be 0, because basically, if you look at the ijth entry of the matrix, it's telling you about the interactions between cloth particles I and j. And for the most part, cloth particles I and j tend to not have any connection. It's only when two particles are neighbors or almost neighbors that there's any interaction. So this matrix is mostly sparse. So one of the challenges here in applied math is we've got to solve this big system. We've got to solve it very often. We want to do it as fast as possible. And so now we start to look at facts like it's sparse. But we also look at facts like if I'm solving the same problem over and over, well, not quite. It's different at each step going forward, but the last solution is probably going to be close to the current solution because things are evolving over time. You start to look at problems like that. But it still takes some mathematical reasoning and requirements, and you still have to have, you know, kind of some deeper knowledge sometimes. Here's another simulation that went just a little wrong. Okay. Now, this is a bug, and as you can imagine, since it's a computer program, you might go in there looking at the code looking for a programming bug. This turned out not to be a programming bug. This turned out to be a math bug. One of the worst feelings in the world is when you spend all your time debugging, trying to figure out what you coded wrong, and the answer is, I didn't code anything wrong. I followed the math. I got the math wrong. It turns out here that there's a very important property this matrix has. The details don't matter. It's called being positive semidefinite. If you care, what it means is if you take any f and you dot it against the result of a times f, it always has to be 0 or greater. That's called positive semidefinite. It's a very important property for this matrix to have given the algorithms that we use. And it turned out that we were adding one more kind of force into our model, a new force, and we missed a term, and all of a sudden we destroyed the positive semidefiniteness of this matrix. We fed it into our algorithms, and boom, you see an explosion. I'll show you a clip. As I said, when we first started, our concern for the first movie was just getting one simple garment through. And it was an achievement at the time. Things evolve very rapidly, so within a couple of years, the quality bar goes up, and now the sort of thing that we need to do is something like this. Okay, so I want to leave time for questions, but I can talk some more and show you some more stuff. It kind of depends how close you actually go to 1. So do you want me to stop and break for questions here, or show you one more thing that'll probably take us through to 1? Okay, we'll keep going. All right. All right. Let me tell you a little bit about, because we talked about tailoring. Up and through the movie Ratatouille, in fact, all of our tailoring, all of our cloths were produced by a very traditional process. Real tailoring, the garments that you are wearing, are by and large made out of flat pieces of cloth. Somebody figures out the patterns, they cut them out flat in these very strange shapes, and they put them together into your garment. So in terms of a computer model, this is the way that we did our tailoring for a very long time. We actually formed these flat panels, and then once you have this flat panel, we need a sufficient resolution, enough of points in the triangles to get the things to move and wrinkle and bend. But these are flat pieces, and taking an algorithm which will fill this up with a nice density of triangles is actually a fairly hard problem, but it's not that hard given that you're doing it in 2D. The problem is you take all these flat pieces and you put them together, you're positioning them in 3 space and they're all stretched out. And we actually use our simulation system to relax it into place so that it looks something like this. So this is actually a suit jacket. So that's our process. Flat pieces, let the simulator relax it, and you get a shape. Now when you're actually going through and doing this, you go through a lot of iterations. So this is Bob from The Incredibles, and watch his suit jacket over time. See that little change there? A little change. And got that one? And that's a bigger change, but look at the silhouette there and then a small change there. Now the problem is that the level of sophistication to think about the change that you want to make in 3D and reverse engineer that to what you have to do here is really, really hard. Literally, it takes a digital tailor. It takes someone who really understands the tailoring process. What's the problem with that? The problem was, at our studio, we simply didn't have enough people who could do that. There were basically about 3 people in the entire studio who could do that well. When I tell you that casting wars and almost fistfights broke out over who got them for their movies, I'm not kidding. They would go into really tense meetings and there would be fights about who they were going to get. So we wanted to solve this problem, and let me talk about a little bit more mathematics. This is something that I was making up this talk and I actually forgot it was there. I don't even think about it as mathematics. It's so ingrained. Most of the models that you see these days at Pixar and other places is done with a very special process called subdivision surfaces. And what's really cool is the modeler actually makes what looks like a kind of flat and somewhat jagged model like this. What you do is you do this automatic process. You take each face, you split it into 4, and you move the vertices a little bit with a very simple algorithm. So this is level 0. You split it once, you got level 1. You do it again, you got level 2. Eventually, this converges to a limit. And so the people who make our models, they're thinking this in their head, but they know how to do this to basically get this shape. And so that's how all our modeling is done. So in fact, you see this nice shape of a shirt. This is actually done with a staggeringly low number of points, believe it or not. That is actually the mesh that creates that garment there. And the reason is because you can see I'm drawing the curves that go with it. That's all it takes to get that nice shape. And that was fine until we started doing simulation. But now we've got a little bit of a problem. As we start to deform this, as we let our simulator bring this into new shapes, you realize I don't have enough points in that original mesh to possibly get the kind of wrinkles that I want here. Okay? I need a higher density of points to get there. Okay? This is just not enough points to get this kind of a shape out of it. And you might say, well, why is that a problem? You just told me about this process where you start with a shape. Well, why don't you just up-res it? Okay, let's start doing that. Let's up-res. And here's something to note. The original shape, if I had a rectangle here, I get a rectangle here, just smaller. Do this again. Okay, I'm getting more and more detail, and in fact now I'm starting to get too much detail, okay? I've really over-modeled this. I've really over-modeled this in the corners here, okay? The other thing that you'll note about this is not a gradual process. So when someone says, that's almost enough resolution, could you give me a bit more? The answer is, well, no. My next step is 4 times higher. So you do that, and now the director is happy, and the people who run your render farm or servers are like, why is the simulation taking so long? And you're like, well, because that's all I could do, And it turns out that what we actually needed was a new process that could actually up-res these surfaces. So for example, we want to take a shape like this and be able to get a shape like this or a shape like this. So this was a new thing that we needed to work on, a way of being able to really vary the resolution while still getting very regular patterns out of it. It turns out to be a very hard problem because it's not enough to be able to do this. You may be given constraints. Let me talk about that in a second. Basically, the algorithm for doing this is an exploration. Start at some point in the surface, try wandering out kind of in a hexagonal pattern, but it's hard. You're wandering on the surface trying to put down triangles, but your wandering isn't in a straight line because you have to walk over the surface. So by the time you walk from here to here and here to here, you may discover, oh, these didn't exactly line up. I got to start coalescing them. It's even more complicated because the tessellation, the pattern, may have very specific constraints. You may say, yeah, kind of fill in the area here, but by the way, I insist that you actually hit these lines exactly because I need to have that precise detail and do something like that. That leads you to problems like saying, okay, I'm going to lay down the law that these vertices have to be here exactly in this line. And now you get this exploration algorithm which has to do very intelligent things like saying, well, I can't take a step here, I'll cross the line. I can't take a step here. And I'm kind of jumping through this, but you actually get a very complicated algorithm which is trying to find a way to intelligently cover this surface, meet a whole lot of constraints. It again runs into problems at the ends, not being able to finish things. At the end, you get hopefully a nice result like this. Now, one of the funny things about this is that when we're working on this process, we were actually working on this for a movie called Toy Story. We're actually working on this while we were making Toy Story 3. We knew we had some kids in the movie, and we knew the kids were wearing clothes. We had a large variety of them. We weren't actually working on this in service of Toy Story 3. We're actually working on this in service of the next movie, which was called Brave, which had some very complex costumes. And we thought we had a fairly limited number of costumes to do in Toy Story 3 because the only humans that we really need to do were this set of kids. Until Ken came along. And our director, John Lasseter, was sitting in a movie, and he said to himself, and he said out loud, he said all of a sudden when they were reviewing Ken, he said, you know what? Ken has got these outfits. What if, he said, what if the running gag was that every time we see Ken in the movie, he's wearing a different pair of clothes? And like 90% of the room was like, oh, that's great, that's brilliant. And the other 10% of the technical people were going, great, great. And so what was very funny is this problem of trying to find a way for our conventional modelers, not the tailors, but the conventional modelers who are just using shapes to just draw the clothes in the way that they were used to as three-dimensional shapes, turned out to be exactly what we needed to be actually to get through this challenge. A lot of these outfits here were seen very, very briefly in the movie. So one of the things about this kind of mathematical modeling was it actually made it so fast to do that we were able to afford to do a scene like the following. And you can see how briefly some of these outputs have their appearance. Okay, let me stop there and we'll see if people have any questions. Thanks very much.
So when you write these algorithms to run, and then so you obviously there comes a point where you have all the code and you click run. After that point, about how long does it take for your computer or your server or whatever to render the entire movie?
Do you mean to draw it on the screen or to run the physics simulation?
Let's go
With both. The physics simulations, if something takes more than 30 seconds per frame, that starts to get to be a long time to wait. The artists are kind of happier if a simulation can run in, say, 10 seconds per frame, 24 frames per second. You can do the math on that. The simulation, we actually use multi-threading and parallelization, but we have to run it on one computer. So you have to run the simulation sequentially. Once the result is done and you're drawing the frames, each frame can be rendered completely in parallel on the farm. So the answer is during the day-to-day working, they like frames at some quality to be done in an hour because that's reasonable turnaround. You're competing with other people for computer resources. And the final answer is that if a frame takes longer than a day to be drawn, and some frames do, not any of those then somebody starts to get really, really unhappy. So it varies. Some frames may take up to a day, but they like it for frames to be, say, an hour or less is kind of a good ballpark figure.
You mentioned water and mesh and clothes. What are some other applications that this modeling can go towards, like fire or is anything like that?
Fire, not really, or fog. Something that this doesn't really lend itself to is, so far these have been either strands, like strings, or meshes. When you're doing something that's volumetric, clouds, fog, smoke, you start to want to do something very different. Water is kind of in between. You can model water in two different ways. You can model it as a sea of particles, which is one approach, but you can also model water as a fixed grid, and you can say how much density there is in each cell, and people do it two different ways. The modeling that I've done, we actually adapted our cloth simulator and turned it into a water simulator for Finding Nemo. And the code would run and say, basically at the top, FizzT adapted to water, never to be used again, because it was a horrible hack when we did it, and it actually got used for 2 movies, but now they use different techniques. So, the questions back here?
What were you doing in the Lord of the Rings? What were you modeling?
I didn't work directly on the Lord of the Rings, but an earlier version of this software that you saw here was done while I was at Pixar. An earlier predecessor version of that was actually a commercial system, which was available, and the people who did Lord of the Rings were using it for some of the shots in Lord of the Rings. I don't know specifically which ones.
So I have 2 questions. When you were showing the triangulation in the mesh, do you guys use like splines a lot? And the second question is, how often do you use like finite differences and that sort of stuff in like developing motion? Is it mostly a combination of that and matrices or?
Yeah, so the simulation of the cloth and also the hair, I said that there was a big linear system going on there, and that's because you're doing something, it's kind of akin, it basically is a finite element method. People make a lot of distinctions and get very bogged down in the terminology, but that's basically what's going on where the linear system comes from. Splines, the curvedness of the surfaces, people used to use spline surfaces, but those actually turned out to be very difficult to deal with. The curved surfaces pretty much from all over now come with what we call the subdivision process, and it's called a subdivision surface, where you do this splitting and splitting and splitting, and you get these very nice smooth shapes. So splines aren't used that much directly in shapes these days.
What are the biggest challenges in this, and like what problems are you hoping to solve in the future?
Oh boy, biggest problems. The biggest problems are are ones of practice and economics. There's always a trade-off these days. Well, as the computers get more and more powerful and the chip progress is stopped, people have started to put more and more cores together, so you have more and more parallel processing. So these days it's not uncommon for your one computer to maybe have 8, 16, maybe 32 processors. And so now you're faced with this challenge of, well, I've got all these processors, and what I want to do to make it faster is divide the problem up into lots of small pieces. And how do I do that efficiently? It's very rare that you can actually have 16 things working on a problem together and actually get 16 times the efficiency. So that's one big challenge. Another perpetual challenge in all of this is, as I said, the animators animate the characters, but they don't want to be concerned with where the clothes go. That's actually a lie. They don't want to be concerned with where the clothes go as long as the software makes them go where they think the clothes should go. As soon as the software doesn't do that, then all of a sudden they say, that was great, except could you make this one wrinkle do this? Or when they go like this, could you make it be more heroic? And we usually say, oh, sure, we'll turn up the heroic knob. And they go, thank you, that's great. and we snarl and go back to our work. So one of the really big controls is, really big challenges is actually coming up with ways to control it, to make it do what we want while still looking reasonable or getting the look that the director wants. So I would say that probably the biggest challenge going forward has been and always will be the control aspects of this.
Yeah, so I was curious about your algorithm for sort of wandering to sort of find the point. Are you doing it at like sort of set intervals sort of to simulate continuity, or is there sort of a discrete set of points that you're going to search for first when you're up-resing?
So the algorithm, which is making that nice mesh, that is not done during the simulation because you want that mesh to stay constant. So in fact, before you even start the simulation, we get the model, that mesh, that square mesh from the modeler, and we run our algorithm on it, and then we make sure that we like the set of triangles that it produced or the density of it. And once we're satisfied with that, that mesh gets stored, permanently in a file. Like, that's the model now, and I will use that model to run all my simulations because it needs to stay constant and not change itself.
So like, how does it sort of create the triangles? Is it sort of more of a general search, or is there, like, are there certain points that you look for first when creating?
Let's put this one up. So it's literally a searching algorithm. It's a walking algorithm. You start at one particular point. You say, here's my starting point. I'm going to try to wander out and basically, someone do the math. Is these 60 degrees apart? 60 degrees apart. I'm going to try to wander out in 6 directions. And I'm going to say, I'm going to wander out this distance and this distance and this distance. I'm going to plunk down points. Then I'm going to keep doing that. So it's basically kind of a spreading out from the center. And I'll plunk down the points, and that will become my triangle network. And as I said, the problem is you won't exactly meet up, so you have to decide where to merge things. You can't cross over boundaries. And you're wandering around a fairly complicated surface because you're not really going in a straight line. You're basically following the geodesic along this to get as straight as you can on a curved surface. Yes?
So Pixar was sold, I think, in 2006,
Mhm.
before that Steve Jobs. Did you have, first 2 questions, did you have any interaction or funny stories with Steve Jobs? And the second, how has like working at Pixar changed since Disney had bought it?
Those are great questions. In fact, my initial interaction with Pixar, as I said, we had a small software company which sold a predecessor of the software. And in order to come to Pixar, we had to basically sell off this company. It would have been a conflict of interest to be selling to other studios which became our competitors. So one of my first interactions was flying out to Pixar with a colleague, going down to Palo Alto and talking with the president of Pixar and Steve Jobs. And I had a very surreal moment. It was if, imagine that you play Little League baseball, and imagine that you blink your eyes and you're standing at Yankee Stadium and there's a bat in your hand and you're looking, there's a major league pitcher. My first thought would be, oh my God, this guy could probably kill me with a fastball. And that was kind of the interaction. But Steve was very, very nice, and he knew, that he was very interested in obtaining this software. Steve was around for quite a while and had some really good things in terms of shaping the direction. But he knew at Pixar that it was the artistic things which were driving things. So he would occasionally make comments, but he never ever, firmly said, oh, I think the movie should be like this, or I think it should be like that. And when Pixar was acquired by Disney, the people who put that together were very careful to make sure that there wouldn't be any loss of the culture. So we're about an hour apart from, hour by flight from Disney. We're in the Bay Area, Disney's down in LA. And so thus far we've had very good collaboration, but there's been no attempt by either studio to put the other one in its mold, which is a really good thing. So it's worked out very, very, very well. Very well. Yes, I did know Randy. Randy was at Carnegie Mellon up until he died, and I overlapped with him there as a professor there. He came in, I think, just a year or so before I left, and he was also in the computer graphics, human factors. He did a very wonderful lecture at the beginning of each class where he would take a sledgehammer to a VCR as an exercise in what not to build for your user interface. Yes?
As you collaborate with the artists, how much do each party have to learn about what the other's doing to really work better together?
Well, it's extremely necessary that we understand what the animation does, and it's necessary for the animation to understand exactly what we are doing. But that said, it's Pixar Animation Studios, so the balance is a little bit skewed in their favor. So, for example, there's some scenes. There was a great shot of one chef grabbing the other and pulling him down like this. That it doesn't actually work that way. It's not like he is grabbing your shirt and literally pulling you. In fact, he is animated for his hand holds like this, and then you have to put the cloth in his hand. But that was actually a back and forth. He delivered an initial animation. We started to run some simulations, and we said, this isn't going to look right. Given that where you've grabbed his cloth, you're too far away from his chest. It'll look funny and ridiculously cartoony. So that was kind of a back and forth collaboration. The animators needed to learn, what they could do in terms of making it look correct and what not. I'm much more on the technical side of things, but it's sort of like, I've built this car, and the first time out, it's going to say, let me show you how to drive it. And I kind of, show people how to use it. But then it's going to be taken over by people who are technical but have more of an artistic eye than I do, and who are really going to be really good at running it but still getting the kind of look that they want. So it's a very fluid and continuous line there. Yes?
So this is more about your workflow.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find yourself spending a lot of time coding in a lower level language to get the physics engine to work? Or do you spend a lot of time working with the engine and showing it to other people?
It varies. When we're coming up with new things, it's mostly about the mathematics involved, or sometimes the algorithms, but at that level, the algorithms are still math. So there's a lot of, the system is written in C++. I've been programming long enough that it doesn't really get in my way. It's, I'm expressing what I want. But then a lot of times there's a huge amount of debugging that goes on. I showed examples of things going wrong, and this happens kind of all the time. It's not, the ideal is that you give them black box software. You run it, it'll work, it'll be perfect. And the reality is someone's always coming up with a situation that you didn't think of. Animators are always doing crazy things. When you can't see what is on the screen, we get very afraid. So if I'm like this to the camera, and you can't see my arm back here, as a simulation artist, I am terrified, because you may think that, I put my arm in a reasonable position, but if you can't see it, the animator is likely to have shoved it through my back. He doesn't care, he or she doesn't care, and that can drive the software nuts. So there's a lot of debugging that goes on to try to get these things to work and figuring out what kind of crazy things it's being faced with.
Is there any interaction between this field and people who are trying to model real things, like car accidents and things like that?
Yeah, I was joking that before when I was in academia, before I came to a movie studio, what we're working on was this kind of simulation. And the answer, when you go to a funding agency and they say, what is this really best suited for? And the answer is, well, actually, it's really best suited for making movies, which is generally not something a government funding agency wants to hear. And so, if I had stayed in academia, you could consider, well, let's try to up the fidelity and really be predictive, and try to do something like, for example, use this to model airbag deployment. And maybe you could do that, but that's a scary prospect there, because you got to get it right. You can't say, well, it's only off by a factor of 2. Well, okay, that's a big problem, right? So yeah, if you take this and you go in the direction where absolute accuracy and speed is not the requirement, it's just being more and more high fidelity, then yeah, you could take this and do a lot with it in those directions. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop because it's way past 1. Thank you very much.